It was this past Halloween, and I went out to this mall with some friends after school. We were a group of 8 senior guys, but decided to go trick-or-treating for the last time before it became questionable. Hell, it's even more questionable now, seeing 6-foot guys walking around in pirate costumes. But hey, we might as well have some fun, right? We went into the mall to find it empty for a bit, and sooner the mall got more and more full with mums and their kids trick-or-treating at the different stores. Before we left, we all got a quick bite to eat from the food court before we went trick-or-treating. Our plan of going about Halloween was not traditional though. In a nutshell, we would be driving in my friend's car, and we would be driving up and down neighbourhoods with the Take One bowls and dumping them in pillowcases or trash bags. Before we left, we were on our way to the exit when I had the massive urge to go to the toilet. After all, I hit some tacos from Taco Bell, and I don't know how I didn't expect this coming. I told them to go ahead and that I would catch up to them. I was starting to sweat from the urge to go, and I went pretty deep into the mall to find a restroom, finding the sign saying restrooms in a long white hallway. Now, without thinking, I ran into the first restroom I saw and went straight to the stalls. I can remember feeling relief as I went in and sat down ready to do my business. Right before I was about to, I heard this old, raspy voice. "Son, I think you're in the wrong restroom." I froze, and I let out a somewhat choked, "What?" The old and raspy voice showed who he was as he bent down to tell me, "You're in the girls' restroom, son." He let out some sort of twisted giggle or cackle. I can remember his face clearly. Old and wrinkled, white tannish skin. White hair with round frame glasses that made his psychotic eyes huge. I was frozen, no, in complete shock and horror, as I sat there looking at this man who was in the girls' restroom. Who the hell knows why? He had this long ear-to-ear grin. The old man broke the awkward silence by saying, "You know what? I'm going to pay you a visit." He had this long ear-to-ear grin with only his lips, and he began to cackle more, showing his brown and rotten teeth. At that moment, I knew it was time to get the hell out of there. All I can remember before I took off was seeing him starting to crawl under the stall to me. I sat up, not even zipping my pants or putting on my belt, just pulling them up and ran. I dashed out of there as fast as I could, looking like I had just crapped my pants. As I was running out of the hallway, I looked back and saw the old man sprint walking out. He was about 6'3" and wearing an olive khaki jacket with black stained pants and construction boots. I kept booking it all the way until I was out of that mall. I see my friends in their cars waiting on me. I ran up to my friend Fox's car and I was shaking as I was putting on my seatbelt. He asked me what was wrong. I told him in a stern voice to start the car. My friend Skylar was next to me asking me why, but I cut him off and raised my voice higher. "We gotta go, now!" Fox started the car and signalled the rest of our friend group. We drove out of there. I didn't bother looking back. I've had some other strange encounters with some people, some weirder than others, but I never thought that one of these days I would find myself in that position of being face to face with a deranged person in a restroom. I haven't seen him since, not that I would want to, and I just pray that he left the mall as soon as I did. What still keeps me up at night, however, is why. Why was he in the girls' restroom in the first place?
Back in 5th grade, I planned to go trick-or-treating with my friend Thomas and his little sister after we all got home from school. It was a Tuesday, meaning our parents wouldn't let us stay out super late, but we definitely wanted to hit up most of the houses in our neighborhood, because some of them gave really good candy. 5:30 rolled around, and my family and I had finished eating dinner and were waiting for Tom and his sister to arrive. Unfortunately, our plans fell through when his mom called us and told us Tom started throwing up and wouldn't be able to make it. That meant if I wanted to go trick-or-treating, I'd have to go with my mom, since she insisted I not go alone. I really didn't want to do that, so I agreed to help hand out the candy instead. Half an hour later, and the trick-or-treating picked up, with people ringing our doorbell almost constantly. At one point, this other kid from my school, Bruno, showed up. He was there by himself, and he wasn't wearing a costume, except if you count his t-shirt with a picture of a ghost on it. I didn't know Bruno since he wasn't in any of my classes, but I'd always gotten antisocial vibes from him. When he rang our doorbell, my mom answered the door and recognized him as one of the kids from my school. Bruno greeted my mom and asked for candy very enthusiastically, though I don't think he'd ever met her before. Then when my mom saw he was alone, she suggested that he and I go trick-or-treating together, which Bruno readily agreed to. Honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to, but the lure of candy got the better of me. We walked down our front walkway and onto the sidewalk, and not gonna lie, it was pretty awkward. In contrast to how Bruno spoke to my mom, he seemed less friendly with me. He told me we were going to hit the rest of the houses on my block and kept walking, so I followed him. Each time we trick-or-treated at a house, he'd greet the people who lived there just as enthusiastically, and I figured it was to get more candy. Maybe it worked, because by the time we reached the corner, my pumpkin bag was over halfway full. I expected us to just cross the street and move to the next block, but this is where things took a much darker turn. Bruno stopped and turned to face me, and asked me if I wanted to have a little fun. I had no idea what he meant by that, but something about the look he gave me and the way he said it immediately creeped me out. I didn't want to be a stick in the mud, so I said, yeah, sure. Bruno then reached into his bag and pulled out one of those fake plastic knives that retract when you poke it into someone. I didn't like where this was going, but I also didn't want to say anything. Instead of starting to walk again, we just stood there as another group of kids without any parents came by. All of a sudden, Bruno grabbed one of the girls, who was maybe 8 or 9, and held the knife up to her throat. He told her to give him her candy, and she and the other kids in her group started screaming. The girl dropped her basket and they all ran away, but Bruno didn't seem to care. He didn't even get any candy from the basket, he just left it there. Bruno must have just wanted to mess with them. I think he could sense that freaked me out, because he smiled and told me we needed to do just one more thing. I was dreading whatever that thing was, and though I wanted to run away myself, I was terrified of what Bruno might do. We walked a couple houses over until we got to this one house with large bushes in the front yard. I didn't know what Bruno had planned, but he picked up a large stick which was kind of pointed at the end. He crouched down behind one of the bushes and motioned for me to join him. I crouched beside him, my heart pounding. Eventually 2 kids slightly older than we were walked up to the door. Right after they'd gotten their candy and started to walk back down the walkway, Bruno lunged at one of them with the stick, grabbed his shoulder, and held the stick to his neck. Both of them screamed and ran away. I was done. I told Bruno, while trying to conceal the fear in my voice, that I needed to leave. However, I'm sure he saw right through that. He smiled and pointed the stick towards me, then playfully poked it. I recoiled in fear, and he laughed. I started backing up slowly, and thankfully Bruno just stayed where he was, watching me. When I got to the next house over, I started running back to my house. When I rang our doorbell and my mom answered, she asked if I had fun with Bruno. I shrugged my shoulders and said it was okay, but my mom saw through my voice as well. She asked me more questions like where we went, and eventually I broke down and told her what happened. Even though I don't want to admit it, I started to cry. My mom became livid and told me she'd have a talk with the school and Bruno's parents. We had no idea where Bruno lived, and we had none of his parents' contact information, so my mom had to request that from the school when she called them the next day. Apparently Bruno's issues were well known to the administrators, who had already met with Bruno and his parents several times. He even had to meet with a school counselor every week. I didn't know why Bruno didn't have more of a reputation at school, but I guess he saved his bad behavior for outside of school. My mom spoke with Bruno's mom on the phone and tried to tear her a new one, but Bruno's mom just started yelling back before quickly hanging up. I'm not sure if that did anything, but Bruno did leave our school 3 months later. But that wasn't the end of the story. The week after we didn't see Bruno at school anymore, I was lying on my bed at night with the window open when I heard a noise come from outside. It sounded like a metal object being tapped against the brick wall of our house. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, so out of curiosity I walked to my window and looked down. It was already dark outside, and I didn't see anything that could have been making that sound. But that's when I made the connection with Bruno and my blood ran cold. Several seconds after I walked to the window, the noise stopped, and I thought I could hear someone moving through the bushes. I closed the window and got my mom and dad, who were getting ready for bed. My mom was scared, but my dad put his shoes back on, grabbed one of his old lacrosse sticks, and ran out of the front door screaming. We heard him go all around the house, and at one point one of our neighbors even came outside. I assume my dad explained the situation, and a minute after that he came back inside. Apparently there was no sign of Bruno or anyone else. Though I was paranoid after that, nothing else suspicious ever happened again. Or maybe just one thing. 2 weeks later, when my dad was working on the lawn and trimming the bushes, he found a steak knife lodged deep inside one of the bushes directly underneath my window. And there's only one way I can think of as to how it got there.
I've had my one good scare this Halloween season. I'm still fine, and the incident hasn't recurred. While I tend to agree with a consensus here, it was not merely a prank, but someone with sinister intentions. It seems that the police were able to spook them off, or they moved on somewhere else. I've also purchased and installed a doorbell camera, as well as another outdoor camera I've hidden elsewhere, so I won't be caught unawares again. This is going to be a pretty tame story compared to a lot of the other great ones I've read here, but since it happened to me, I think it's pretty spooky. I'm definitely buying a doorbell camera as soon as possible. I'm writing this only a few hours after everything happened. Now that I've calmed down and the sun is coming up, and I feel somewhat safer. Last night, I was laying in bed, reading a little before I went to sleep. I think it's important to clarify that I live on the outskirts of my town. Still in town, but definitely on the edge, off the highway that leads out of town and into about 15-mile long stretch of lots of country. Woods, fields, a few residences, but mostly open highway. So other than the other tenants in my actual apartment building, it's normally very quiet in my area. My building is a square with 4 apartments, and for each of us, our door simply faces out into the open. There's no lobby or foyer or anything. My door in particular looks out into a large field that goes uphill. I don't remember the exact time, but sometime between 1 and 2 a.m, someone randomly started banging on my door, which freaks me out at the best of times in broad daylight, but especially in the middle of the night. I nervously went to ask who it was, and the guy, with a deep voice, claimed he was a police officer and that I needed to let him in. That's what he said. I needed to let him in. Not I needed to open the door. Luckily, I watch and listen to a lot of true crime stuff, so I got pretty suspicious real quick. I never asked him why I needed to let him in, what I supposedly did, and he never asked what my name was. He also didn't really sound like a cop, if you know what I mean. Obviously, I was feeling creeped out, so I called 911 to confirm that there was an actual police officer at my address, and they said there wasn't. At this point, I'm freaking out, and I kind of call out through the door that I'm on the phone with the police, and the guy kind of bangs on my door one more time, then stops making noise. I presume because he ran off at this point. They dispatched 2 cars to my apartment, and the officers took a good look around. Unfortunately, the guy was long gone by the time they got here, and I never saw him, so I don't have a description of him or anything. But the cops said 2 things to make me feel better. 1, they'd post more patrols in my area over the Halloween weekend, and 2, it was most likely just a Halloween prank because the bar down the street from my apartment had had a party, and it had just closed not too long before. Always trust your instincts, and remember that if you have any doubts about someone claiming to be a police officer, call your emergency services and confirm they are who they say they are. Dispatch and the officers who came tonight told me you will not get in trouble for making sure the person talking to you is actually an officer. This also applies to situations where it's nighttime and dark, so you can't really see for sure if it's a real cop car behind you or not. If you see flashing lights behind you on a back road or dark area at night, put on your hazard lights and call 911 first to make sure it's actually a police car. You won't get into trouble. Better safe than sorry. Anyway, I hope that anonymous guy was merely a drunken Halloween prankster and not someone who had sinister intentions. Whoever you are, let's not meet.
There was once a guy that lived in our neighborhood named Jimmy. He got picked on a lot for being a confident and funny guy. His mouth tended to get him into a lot of trouble, and he seldom learned his lesson. He was just very content with who he was, and refused to change. When people asked him why he let them wail on him for his blunt comedy and wisecracks, He'd smirk and say, "Honesty is the best policy. At least they're not hiding anything from me, and neither am I from them." One of the kids he inadvertently ticked off with a rather crude MILF joke was something of a psychopath with a sadistic streak who didn't take kindly to the insult. He rounded up the other guys who didn't like Jimmy, and they cornered him after school in the science room. "Your mouth got you into this. I want you to remember that," said Brett, the ringleader, as he looked into Jimmy's terrified eyes. They grabbed some formic acid stored in the lab and threw it into Jimmy's face. They stood around, watching him scream in agony as it ate through his flesh, before sniggering and running out, pretending to be concerned and wanting to help him. When the paramedics arrived and were attending to Jimmy, who was no longer able to scream, the principal asked the boys if they knew what happened. Their leader, Brett, explained that they were walking past when they saw Jimmy skulking around the lab room. By the time they got in there, he was already in that state. The other members joined in and backed Brett up with other fake details as Jimmy tried to protest in silent agony. The principal nodded and told them that he would speak to them later after he had a word with Jimmy and gotten his side of the story. A few days passed, and Jimmy was kept in ICU with bandages on his face, the doctors salvaging what little they could of it. His vision was still intact in one eye, and his jaw withstanding, despite the loss of flesh. He was still unable to speak and refused to respond to anyone. He just sat there, eyes unblinking and staring at the ceiling, bloodshot and filled with animosity. When he was discharged sometime later, he wouldn't respond to anyone with anything other than the word, "liars." His social life gone, unable to smile or even crack a joke anymore, he secluded himself in his room and began to plan. Sick, vindictive thoughts started appearing in his mind. He would get them all, one by one, decimate them, slice them, burn them. He waited patiently until the group would be vulnerable. Late at night, when they said their goodbyes and went home separately, that's when he would strike. That weekend, Brett received a package in the mail. Curiously, he opened it to find a VHS tape with the words, "For you," etched crudely onto the front. He put it in and played it. It was a crudely recorded home video by an unknown cameraman who didn't speak at all for the duration of the film. It began with the camera pointing at the date on a newspaper. It was yesterday. As he zoomed out, you could see that the camera was in a basement, a single flickering light bulb hanging above and casting an uncomfortable scene. By the time the camera had completely zoomed out, it was apparent that this was no normal video. In front of the cameraman, and on his hands and knees, was one of Brett's friends. He was naked, a dirty blindfold around his face, and a crude gag in his mouth. He was covered in blood, horrific burns, lacerations, and wounds. One especially large wound on his back stood out from the rest. It almost looked like a word. The cameraman, with gloved hands, took the gag out of the crying boy's mouth, and immediately he began begging to go home. "Please, please, let me go, man. I did what you wanted. Oh my God, Jesse, Mike, Keith, you made me butcher them. I just want to go home, man. Please. I'm sorry, guys. I'm so sorry." He just kept repeating it over and over, rocking back and forth as he did so. Brett's legs began to shake, and he felt bile rise in his stomach. He could see the burned, mangled bodies in the background. The bodies of his friends. All of them had markings on their bodies in deep, large cuts. The cameraman reached out for the boy's chin and lifted it up, encouraging him to stand. He did so obediently, and he was slowly led to a door off-screen, whimpering. At that point, Brett could see what had been cut into his friend's back. It was the word, "liar." The camera cut out temporarily. When it restarted, they were no longer inside. They were instead out in the cold snow on the outskirts of the woods, and it didn't appear to be the original man holding the camera anymore. It was Brett's friend. He was whimpering and shivering as he held the camera in one place for 30 seconds, pointing at some trees in the distance, hearing footsteps draw nearer and nearer. "Where are you, man? You said I could go, man! You said I could go!" The boy was screaming and crying, frightened out of his mind as the sound of crunching snow drew nearer from seemingly every angle. Then, it stopped. He turned around to see the mangled face of Jimmy. A horrifying howl blared through the speakers, and the word, "Liars" appeared before the tape abruptly stopped. Brett felt faint, and he darted to lock the front door, knowing what was coming. As he turned to run for it, he immediately hit something and fell backward. The last thing he ever heard was, "Liars!" as acid ran down his face and began to slowly eat away at his flesh. The last thing he saw was Jimmy's face, contorted into a sick, twisted smile.
I'm a 25-year-old female, and I live in France, where this story happened approximately 12 years ago, to me, my sister, and a group of friends. I was about 12 or 13 at the time, and my sister was 10 or 11. A little bit of context: our parents were part of a running club, and they were meeting with old members for a little party, spending the evening together, having a drink, and dining at one of the members' houses. Those members were also the parents of some of our friends from school. So we were a group of 7 or 8 children at the party. Some were in my class, others in my sister's class. So we all knew each other pretty well. While our parents were minding their business, we had spent the early evenings scaring each other, watching scary videos, and telling each other creepy stories. When it got dark, around 10 p.m, we decided to go for a walk in our village. It's a small village, about 800 people, in which nothing happens, except for some occasional burglaries. It is a safe place, and neither we nor our parents were apprehensive about us going out at that time. After roaming in the streets around the soccer field and the school, we decided to go into the cemetery, which surrounds the church. It's basically built in a round shape around the church. We entered by the back door of the cemetery, behind the church, meaning we couldn't see the actual entrance. We were zigzagging between the tombs, being respectful and not touching or breaking things, just goofing around and joking. Suddenly, my sister, who was a bit ahead of us, facing the entrance, froze. Speechless, moving her hands weirdly into the air. In shock, she screamed, "There's someone!" Being kids, we just ran, not knowing better and already being scared from our previous activities. We exited the cemetery at full speed, stopped a few meters away, and immediately laughed it off, thinking she was pranking us. But she wasn't. Still in shock, she described a lady with a long black cape, with black sleeves, and a black hood covering her head, who was slowly climbing the stairs, entering the cemetery. She had long and curly red hair. Another friend, quite freaked out, also admitted he had seen her and described the same witchy-like outfit, but he didn't see her face. Gathering what courage we had left, we made our way back to the main entrance of the cemetery and looked up the street to see if the lady was still there. No sign of her. She had disappeared. After that, we quickly made our way back to the party, realising what had just happened and a bit shaken up. Her outfit was odd since it was the end of spring, or maybe the beginning of summer, and it was warm outside. Also, the church was closed most of the time, and always at night. So her presence was really odd, and a bit creepy. Actually, we went back outside that night exploring the woods at the end of the village. But we quickly ran off after we saw a beam of light before us. It seems far, but what was odd was that there was no road of houses in this direction. Like it came from the middle of the woods. After observing it, we all swore it was getting closer and we left. Years later, my sister is still adamant she saw her. I recently was talking to her about this story and she swears it's all true. Stay safe out there. Sleep tight, my darlings. Happy Halloween.